believe you had the call.
Thank you, sir. I am pleased to have the opportunity to continue my remarks in relation to the estimates committees from prior to the lunchtime break. Prior to the break, for those who are just picking up the parliamentary broadcast now, or those who have forgotten over the 2 hours intervening what was the pacey and exciting material that we were dealing with before lunch. We just established, thanks to Chief Executive Martin Westwell and the Minister, the Member for Wright, that the Labor Party was delivering on its election commitments, as is appropriate. The funding mechanism they were using to deliver on their election commitments was indeed, in relation to the school election commitments at least, was indeed the funds made available to the Department for Education as a result of the National School Funding Reforms, commonly known as the Gonski Agreement. So using those existing resources from the Department for Education, the department is now first, delivering on the election commitments as is appropriate, and secondly, doing a body of work within the Education Department to identify which programs and services should be cut, or which deferred, or which changed in some way, to make the money available to deliver on those commitments. And we identified what a couple of those commitments were. Obviously, the ongoing funding for the technical colleges, the funding to be made available to relieve families of $100 remission on school fees for the next couple of years, and that was identified by Mr Bernardi and Mr Westwell, and this is all delivering on the government's election commitments. What I am interested to know, sir, and what I think people in education will be interested increasingly to learn is the detail of what other arrangements are being made to create this funding. Now, the Minister was good enough in his responses to confirm a number of programs were proceeding as planned, with no cuts proposed. And in my earlier remarks, I commended him for those, I congratulated him for those. Clontarf and Shooting Stars supporting young Aboriginal South Australians, the International Baccalaureate program at a number of schools, the Literacy Guarantee Unit, the Year 1 Phonics Check, the Music Education Strategy, and a range of pathway initiatives such as Flexible Industry Pathways, the World of Work Challenge, VET for Year 7 to 10 students, which will obviously work well with the technical colleges if it is designed well, as we hope it will be. So all of those are staying. There was one program that was identified would have $15 million over 4 years, changed to $15 million over 6 years, which is not a dramatic reduction in funding, but it is a reduction in funding. And in the coming weeks and months, I trust the Minister will come back to the House in response to my question, which he took on notice, with what other programs there will indeed be changes to. But in relation to this one, there's a $15 million over 4 years to respond to the Graham Report. The Graham Report into suspensions, exclusions and expulsions. The Graham Report itself was a result of a compromise brokered by the Deputy Premier and the Greens spokesperson on education, Tammy Franks, and myself, to help us get through the 2019 changes to, in fact, reforms to the new Education Children's Services Act. And that was a good outcome. It was a good report by Professor Linda Graham, who came down from Queensland, expert in inclusive education, a substantial report with some challenging recommendations, not all of which I agreed with as Minister, but many of which I was very enthusiastic about exploring a way to deliver for South Australian students, particularly that vast number of students with disability who represent such a disproportionate bulk of those students who experience take-home suspensions, exclusions, and not so much expulsions, because that rarely happens in South Australia. But nevertheless, what Professor Graham established was these students were particularly at risk. There was students with Aboriginal students, I should say, students with a range of needs, students under guardianship, certainly represented in the proportion of students in this category. But if they had also a disability, or students just with a disability, they were the vast bulk. $15 million committed by the Marshall Liberal Government over 4 years to deliver a response to this review and its recommendations. That has been stretched to over 6. Some would describe this as a cut. The Minister described it as a big body of work, and I want to make sure that we get it right. No doubt, whatever the model we end up with, we will be, for better or worse, stuck with for some time. Now, I'm pleased it's going ahead. I wish it was over 4 years. It's over 6. I am pleased to note the former government's commitment to an early win in this area for school-wide positive behaviour for learning is being implemented in 40 schools this year and next, and that's going ahead with recruitment for schools currently underway. Consultation on the decommission of flexible learning options is underway, with a set of recommendations going to the Minister this month. We look forward to hearing more about those recommendations in due course, and indeed the Minister, the House will be interested to know, confirmed the government has no plans to agree to follow through on the recommendation of Professor Graham to create an education ombudsman. I don't say that that's a bad response. It's the response that I think the Marshall government would have ultimately come up with too if we were still in government, but nevertheless it's an interesting change of position from the Labor Party. I note in relation to a couple of Labor election commitments, the workforce plan for teachers to teach specialist subjects. We asked when it will be finished, when it will be released, will it deliver on what Labor promised? The Minister took the bulk of that question on notice, and we look forward to the response. We had a discussion about the government commitment to increase permanency rates in the teaching workforce by 10%. The Minister confirmed that currently there is 80% permanency, according to departmental advice, but did seem reluctant to commit to delivering on the election commitment. I'll quote, he said, "My answer is that the department will undertake policy work to identify where the level of teacher permanency can be increased," and then went on to say, while still maintaining flexibility for schools and preschools to manage their staffing needs. Now, there's nothing wrong with that, except it doesn't deliver on what was a pretty specific election commitment in Labor's 7-point plan for teacher quality. There is indeed no plans for significant changes to placement rights, and we learnt that EB negotiations are expected to begin later this year, but to be overseen by the Minister for Industrial Relations, which was a similar arrangement to that which was in place last year. As Minister for Education, I copped some criticism during that time from some for the Minister for Industrial Relations, as was then leading that negotiation. I trust that those who criticised that arrangement will apply the same blowtorch of pressure to the new government, but that's ultimately a matter for them. In relation to early childhood, we had significant discussion about the Early Childhood Royal Commission and the Early Learning Strategy. It was a good discussion, it was interesting and it was nuanced and it was constructive. I'm pleased the government is continuing with much of the work we announced last year during the announcement of the Early Learning Strategy. Well done. Ultimately, no commitment is still on the table to have any offer of universal 3-year-old preschool available to all families in 2026, as what I believe Labor's election commitment was. There's certainly no money in the budget to expand the program. I'm sure we'll talk more about that and the other range of exciting issues that the Minister for Education and I discussed on that interesting day a couple of weeks ago.